Exodus chapter 33, verses 12 through 23. Listen with me as I read from the second book of the Old Testament. Now, if I have found favor in your sight, show me your ways, Moses says to the Lord, so that I may know you and find favor in your sight. Consider, too, that this nation is your people. The Lord said to Moses, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And Moses said to him, if your presence will not go, do not carry us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people, unless you go with us? In this way we shall be distinct, I and your people, from every people on the face of the earth. The Lord said to Moses, I will do the very thing that you have asked, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. Moses said, show me your glory, I pray. And God said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you the name, the Lord, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. But he said, you cannot see my face, for no one shall see me and live. And the Lord continued, see, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the world. Thanks be to God, amen. Is it good to worship today? Yeah, it's good. It's good to worship today. I'm just going to give you a little warning, a heads up, that in my sermon today, I'm going to use a housing metaphor. I don't know if that makes any sense to you considering the status of my life, but just a warning, I'm going to use a housing metaphor. With my home renovation, the move, it's taking all of my imagination. But the truth is, there is a big difference between the two homes that I have owned in the last year at one point at the same time. There's a big difference. The house we moved from and the house we're moving to are very different homes, very different houses. The house we moved out of was built in 2014 by a large corporate housing manufacturer. They build cookie-cutter, prefabricated homes. The house we're moving into was built in 1960 by a builder who made the house with his own hands. Nothing was prefabricated. Every piece of lumber was cut for its specific place in that house. As we ripped out the cabinets in the kitchen, it became incredibly obvious that every single piece was built for that specific place. That means it was a pain to tear out. The house we moved out of was made with cheaper materials, but it looked really nice. It had a nice aesthetic, but the house itself was not all that solid. The house we're moving into was made with a metal beam through the middle of the entire house in the basement. It's got brick walls. It's got solid wood materials throughout. The joists are really way too big for a house this size. That house will not move. But the aesthetic is maybe less appealing. It doesn't have the curb appeal that our old house had. We're working on that piece of the house. But the differences are substantial. One looked really nice and cool, but the structure itself was clearly lacking. It was really hard to maintain a constant temperature on both floors of the house. The other needs some TLC with the appearance and the aesthetic, but good night, it's got a solid structure. It's got some solid bones. One looked like it was a solid house. The other actually is. So I told you I was going to use a housing metaphor for the day. That's it. I'll come back to that a little bit later on this morning. But today we looked at Exodus 33. And I don't know that this is one of the headlines when we think of Moses. When we think of the story of Moses, what do we think of? We think of the burning bush, the parting of the Red Sea, the 10 Commandments, the staff turning into a serpent, the golden calf. I don't know that Exodus 33 makes it in the top 10 of the Moses stories in our imagination. In fact, this passage might be a little bit of a bummer. This passage follows the story of the golden calf, where the people created an idol of God. And here we read about Moses having an argument with God. And Moses seems to be quite upset with God, and Moses does not hold back in telling God about his frustrations or his desires or his wants. Moses says to God, hey, show me your ways. And what does God say? It says, my presence will go with you. I will give you rest. Woo, that's great, right? Thanks, God. Not for Moses. Moses says, well, it better. You better go with us, otherwise we're not going. Unless you go with us, we're not going. And God says, okay, I will do the thing that you ask. And Moses, still not content, says, great, now show me your glory. Prove it. Prove it to me that you will go before me. Show me your glory. How am I to know who is it that is going before me? And what does God say? God says, geez, this dude sure is needy. Right? No, God says, yes, I will go before you, and I will speak the name, the Lord, before you. Moses is apparently pretty hard to satisfy. Moses is persistent, if nothing else. But this is an interesting passage in the Old Testament because it seems that Moses is in the driver's seat of this engagement, of this interaction, of this conversation, does it not? Moses is the one saying the things, and God is responding to those things. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration that Moses is in the driver's seat, but God is responding to and is apparently affected by Moses' prayer. I hope that's a word of encouragement to us. But here, as in other places, we read that God is changing God's mind. In other verses, we read that God repents of his decisions. After the flood, God says, I will never destroy the earth by water again. And that story, if you want to, this is maybe a separate message, but the rainbow in the sky after the flood is God putting down his bow, dropping his weapon. I will not use a weapon again. God in other places changes his mind. But in this passage, it isn't just that God changes his mind, it is that God is apparently, seemingly influenced by Moses' prayer. God is affected in some way by Moses' prayer. But God is supposed to be unchangeable and omnipotent and omniscient, right? God, with all knowledge and with all wisdom and with all power, should know what's going to happen and be unaffected by Moses, right? I mean, God is unchanging. Yes, we sing that. I mean, it's in the scriptures. You are the same yesterday, today, and forever. God is unchanging, right? But somehow God is affected by Moses' prayer. Does that mean God is affected by my praying? Does that mean God is impacted by my prayers? Does that mean prayer is not just about me being aware of my own self, but that it actually has an impact on God? What do we mean when we say that God is unchanging? Well, if you'll let me, I'd like to jump into some deep theological waters for just a moment. The word that we use to describe this unchangeability of God in theological jargon is immutable. God is immutable. To speak theologically about God's changing or not changing, we say that God is immutable. And to put a handle on that word, that's where we get our word mutate. God does not mutate. God is not mutable. God's being does not change. We confess this. We believe this. But what are we to do when we come across a text like this and like other texts where it seems that God is affected or God changes his mind or he at least interacts with Moses in such a way that God does what he seemingly hadn't planned to do prior? It's like Moses changes God's plans here. God doesn't say that he's going to pass by Moses, but when Moses asks him, God says, yes, I will do that thing. Almost as if God hadn't intended to do it previously. This is where I think my old pal Karl Barth is really helpful. I've referenced him recently. I'm going to reference him later again this sermon, and I'm positive I'm going to do it again in the future. One of the benefits, or maybe detriments, I don't know, depending on your perspective, of having your pastor still in school is that sometimes his course materials make their way into his sermons. But when discussing if God is mutable, if God can truly change, Karl Barth says, yes, God is unchanging, but that does not mean that God does not interact with or is not affected by his creation, us. He says, yes, God is unchanging, but God is not immobile. And that's such a helpful distinction when thinking about the nature of God. He says that when we want to think about God's unchangeability, we should not think that God is static. Instead, we should see that God is constant. That is a word for God. God does not change. That does not mean that he is immobile. That means God is constant. God is everywhere in his creation and at all times with all his creatures. God doesn't change because God is constant. I like what Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. This is a true God. You see, there is nowhere God isn't, and there is no when God wasn't. And this is what it means when God tells Moses that he is going to speak the name, the Lord. This is the name Yahweh. God tells Moses, I'm going to speak Yahweh to you, which we know means I am the I am. Yahweh is the I am. Yahweh means the existing one. God is existence. God is life itself. And this is what it means when we say that God is never changing. God is Yahweh. God is I am. God is the living God, as we read in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. We serve a living God, which means that God is constant and moving. God is on the move. Think through the scriptures that you know that talk about God's interaction with creation. In the creation story, it says that the Spirit of God hovers over the waters. In the wilderness narrative, when the Israelites were in Egypt, it says that the Spirit goes before the people in a moving column of smoke and fire. When David wants to build a temple that can house God, what does God say to King David? No, I want to stay in the tent and move about my people. I like being in the tent of meeting where I can be in the midst of my people. Malachi calls God a refiner's fire. A fire is both constant and moving. Fire is never not moving. And it's constant. God is called light. And light is always constant and moving. This is why light is one of our most fundamental metrics for speed. The speed of light. It's a constant speed, but it's always moving. The Spirit of God descends on Christ at his baptism, and the Holy Spirit is likened to wind. It blows where it will. God is on the move. Throughout the scriptures, I love to believe that God's never-changing attribute is that God is constant and moving. God is a living God, Yahweh. And in these verses, we see that God is still on the move. Moses says, show me your ways. And how does God respond? I will go with you. God is on the move. Moses says, show me your glory. And God says, I will pass by you. God is on the move. God is constant. We can rely on him. God is on the move. We can interact with him. And this is what makes this passage so valuable for us today. Moses could pray to God the prayers that he does because he knows God's constancy as well as, in boldness, God's accessibility. It is revealed here, and it is revealed most concretely in his petition to see the glory of God. The glory of God, the glory of the one who is constant and mobile. Now, if I were to take a poll of the congregation, I'd be curious how many of us have prayed within the last month or year what Moses prayed. When was the last time that we prayed that we would see the glory of God? Show me your glory. Now, maybe I'm projecting my own prayer life, but we might be praying that God would do something glorious in our life. God, would you do something glorious and majestic and wonderful in my life? But how often do we pray that we would encounter the glorious one? That we would see the glory of God? Chances are not that often, and that's not a criticism. I think we don't pray to see the glory of God because I don't know all the time that we know what it means to ask that. What is the glory of God? How can we describe the glory of God? And is it still something that we can encounter today? Moses asks to see the glory of God. Is that still something we can ask the Lord today? Well, to put it briefly, the glory of God is God's very self. Which, I hate when you define a word with the same word, but that's kind of what this is. God's glory is God's self, which might not be the most helpful definition, but a helpful image might be that of light, which we've already discussed. What does light need in order to be bright? I told you I was going to reference Bart. Again, here I am. He said, light needs only to be light in order to spread brightness. What does light need in order to spread brightness? It needs to be light. And it is in and of itself lightening a dark space. God needs only to be God for his glory to be revealed. So what is the glory of God? It is God's very presence. What is the glory of God? It is God's own being, God's own self, that is encountered by us. The glory of God is the Creator's being as revealed to the creature. God's glory is God's activity in this world and in our lives. God's glory is God's own self-revelation. It is God revealing himself to his people. That is the glory of God. God's revealed presence. And I'm telling you right now, church, God is still in the business of revealing himself. God is still in the business of revealing himself. We on this side of the cross see the revelation of God most clearly in the person of Jesus Christ, which we're going to celebrate in just a moment with the Eucharist. Jesus is the fullest revelation of God. I love how Pastor Brian Zond has put it. If you want to know what God is like, look to Jesus. And we encounter the revelation of God through his Holy Spirit. God is still in the business of glory. God is in the business of being encountered, but maybe if we're honest, we aren't always in the business of encountering God's glory. I don't know about you, but sometimes we might not want to be confronted with a constant and living God. No, sometimes I think we can replace an encounter with an experience. Let me unpack that a little bit. You know, in the chapter right before what we read today, I already told you what it was. The Israelites collected all of their Egyptian jewelry that they took as they fled Egypt, and they gathered it all together. They constructed a calf made out of gold, and they called it God. When we read the story of the golden calf, they weren't making other gods. In Exodus 32, it says, they say, this is our God. They're not adding an additional God to Yahweh. They're saying, look at this golden calf. This is it. Now we have something we can see. Now we have something we can experience. They thought they were being faithful. They thought they were being devout. They thought they were being rather pious even. They were stripping themselves of the gold of Egypt, putting before in worship all of their very best. The golden calf is a story of people trying to cultivate and craft and create an experience of God. And do you know what God said? That ain't me. That's not me. I am not contained in a golden calf. I cannot be housed in that alone. That's not me you're encountering. They were creating something aesthetic they could experience, but that experience was not an encounter with the living God. You know what an encounter with the living God was? I'm going to cover your face, lest you be undone by my presence. You know, church, I wonder how much of contemporary American worship is not unlike that golden calf. I wonder how much we think that the most faithful thing we can do is create an experience. Put a whole lot of value in something aesthetic that gets our juices going. Something that's, really energetic. Something that's really engaging. I don't know, the music wasn't that great. Music was kind of loud. I was kind of distracted. I don't know, there were babies crying in church. Kind of interrupted my flow. I got distracted because I saw them, and then my mind started racing. The lights were way too dark. Man, the color of the carpet, it's just not, the feng shui is off. The tempo of the music was just way too fast. I wonder how much of our time and energy is put into crafting an aesthetic experience, not encountering a living God. Because when you encounter the living God, you cannot leave that place as you entered it. When the constant and living God reveals himself to you, you will be left in awe. You will be left saying, "Who is this King of Glory?" It will not leave you saying, "Oh, man, I wasn't fed today." Or, "Man, music wasn't great today." Now, I think the church in North America is really good at creating a worship experience for people. Make sure the lighting's right. Make sure we got, the right LED lights going everywhere. We got our LED lights. We're not exempt from this. Churches spend a lot of time creating an experience. And I'm not going to throw that out completely. I think there's value in that. However, let us not confuse an experience with aesthetics as an encounter with a living God. We cannot manufacture an encounter with God. And I'm telling you, church, aesthetics is a poor substitute for the glory of God. Do you know how the Quakers worship? Have you ever been to a Quakers worship service? Let me demonstrate a Quaker worship service for you right now. We wait. We wait for God to show up. There is no one performing. There is no one leading other than the living God. The one time I sat in a Quaker worship service, I sat for 20 minutes in silence. And no one said a word until God moved. You see, the cultivating of an aesthetic versus an encounter with the living God is not unlike the two houses that I have lived in this year. My old house was quite aesthetically pleasing, but had a kind of weak foundation. The walls were made out of cheap materials. My new house is built on a solid foundation, and there is a lot of beauty to it, but it might not have the same curb appeal. It might not have the same aesthetic. What I said at the beginning of the service, let me say again. One looks like a solid house. The other actually is. And this is why it can be so hard to know if we are encountering the glory of God, or if we are merely being overcome with the aesthetics of the production that goes into worship. Church, if we are being driven by aesthetics, we might be like my first house, looking really good from the outside. But when the storm comes, I wouldn't want to be there. If we are being driven by aesthetics, we might be like those Israelites in the wilderness, doing their very best, giving all that they have in order to craft something they can experience. This is why Moses prayed, "If your presence will not go with us, why should we even go?" If God's presence will not go with us, church, what are we doing here? If God's presence is not among us, what on earth are we doing? Because I'm telling you right now, I can have a great experience. I can give less than 10% of my income, and I can get it at a Taylor Swift concert. I mean, you want a production, let's go. I don't know if you've ever been to a great concert. You can get sucked into the spirit of that room. I don't know if you've ever been to a sporting event where there's just an electric energy about it. Not Michigan State last night. Sorry, too soon? Always too soon for that game. If I want an experience, I can get it. I can go out and experience it. Do you know what I cannot manufacture? An encounter with God. Because on whose terms is that encounter? It's not mine. God is constant. God is living. And God is on the move. And church, I hope that you know that we today still encounter the glory of God if we can put the experience aside and wait on the Lord. So maybe we shed ourselves from the propensity towards aesthetics in a worship experience, and instead we cry out to God, "Show me your glory." Maybe we leave that golden calf behind and we join our voice with Moses in prayer, calling out to God, "Go before us, otherwise we're not going." Calling out to the Lord, "Reveal yourself to me." And I believe that God still shows up. I believe that God still reveals His glory. Will we ask for it? Will we look for it? Or will we distract ourselves? Will we entertain ourselves to death? Church, God is on the move. And we can encounter the glory of God. This is the good news for us today.